Welcome back, my fellow Python programmers, to a brand new video, and in this one we're going to be looking at if statements in Python. We're going to be looking at conditional tests. We'll be applying those to if statements. We're also going to be using if statements with the lists that we've already learned. And then at the end we're going to have a mini project where you are going to test all of the skills that you've learned so far. So without any further ado, if at any point you feel that you're enjoying the contents of this video, make sure to slap a like because I need to beat the YouTube algorithm. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so on the first line, we use a single equal sign in order to assign this value, that is the apple string, to the variable fruit string. If you're not sure how this works, you can always check out the video. I will link it at the top somewhere. And on the second line, we are printing out the result of an operation, that is the two equal signs, done on the variable. We are comparing the variable fruit to the string apple, and if they are equal, then the result is going to be true. So if I right click and I run, there we go, you can see that I get a true. And I'm going to dock it right here. So as you can see in here, what I did is I put the expression into a variable, calling it the Boolean expression, and then I printed out this expression. I also printed out the type of the variable that we're getting using the type method, and you can see right here that it is of class Boolean. We're going to look deeper into classes later on. But going forward, I'm not going to be setting them in variables and simply printing out the expressions directly. This is just for clarification on how things work. Now keep in mind, when comparing two strings, you have to be careful of the uppercase and lowercase. If I make this into apples with an uppercase A, right click and run, you can see that now it returns false. This is because it's case sensitive. Now what you can do in here is apply a function we learned in a previous video, that is the dot lower. So right here on the fruit I say dot lower, and this will take down any uppercase letters to the lowercase, and now when we compare it with apple with a lowercase, you can see that the result is true. Okay, so what we did in here, first of all, I commented out all of these lines using the Ctrl//, and I added a comment that in here we were checking the equality. But we can also check the inequality using this exclamation mark equal signs, which allows you to determine if two variables are not equal to each other. Like for example, country is set to USA, but country is different than China, and that actually goes into the true. It's actually true because they are different. And in here, if I type in USA, for example, right click and run, you'll see that the result is false because we are checking for inequality, and it returns true when they are not equal to each other. Okay, so now we are looking at numerical comparisons. As you can see, we can use the same operators on our integers, where we have age equal to 27. This is an integer variable, and we compare it with 25, or we check for the equality. And it turns out that 27 is not equal to 25, but it's not equal, using the inequality operator, it's not equal to 25, and we get a true. Okay, so what I'm doing in here is I'm using mathematical numerical comparisons to check if the value is greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. So you can see that, and I also added a string to make things more clear. So you can see right here, age greater than 27, that is false. The age is equal to 27, and we can see this reflected in the second line where age is greater than or equal to 27. This will be very handy when working and expanding your programs. So keep those in mind. Same things hold true. So age less than or equal to 27, that's true. But is age less than 27? No, it's not. So it's a false. We can also check for multiple conditions. So as you can see right here, we have two conditions related with the AND. Sometimes you might need to have two or more conditions to be true in order to take a certain action. In here, we need both conditions to be true to evaluate into a true. We do this using the AND keyword. So you can see that the age must be greater than 100 and the country must be equal to USA in order to get a true. If one of these conditions is not satisfied, like for example the age must be greater than 108, when I right click and I run, I get a false. Even though this condition is satisfied, this one is not, so we get a false in total. So right here, what I did is I'm using, instead of the AND keyword, I'm using the OR keyword. And just to refresh your memory, if you want to duplicate a line, just click anywhere on the line and hit Ctrl D to duplicate it. And if you want to move it around really nicely, or in a very cool way, you can hold down Shift, Alt, and use the arrow keys to move it up and down. But anyway, that's beside the point. As you can see in here, we are using something called the OR. Now this is a slightly different than the AND keyword, because if I right click and I run, you'll see that I get a true. Why? Because only one of these conditions must be satisfied in order to get a true output. If we're using an AND, both must be true. When we're using an OR, if all of them are false, like for example, if I change this to China as well, now this condition is false and this condition is false. Because both of them are false, I finally get a false. But if only one of them is true, like for example, let me change this back to 100. If only one of them is true, we get the output true. Okay, sometimes it's important to check whether a list contains a certain value before taking a certain action. So in here, the keyword in Python allows you to check for the existence of banana in your favorite fruits or for the orange in your favorite fruits. So banana is indeed present inside of the favorite fruits list, so we have a true, but the orange is not, so we get a false. If you don't know anything about lists, then I recommend that you watch the video that I will link right here at the top. And of course, this is also case sensitive, so if I change this from a lowercase a to a uppercase a and I run, you can see that I get false, because banana with an uppercase a in the middle is not present in the favorite fruits, only banana with a lowercase. And other times it's important to know if a value does not appear in a list. So you can use the keyword not in this situation. For example, grape not in favorite fruits returns true. Why? Because just like we were checking for the inequality, we're checking that the grape is not in the favorite fruits, and indeed it's not, so we return a true. Apple, on the other hand, is present in the favorite fruits, so apple not in favorite fruits returns a false. Okay, so we've looked at conditional tests. Now it's time to put them to work when working with if statements. Let's go ahead and continue on. Okay, so now it's time to use the evaluations that we get to change how our program behaves based on these expressions. You can put any conditional test in this line right here, where we have the if statement, and just about any action in the indented block that we have below. We've already covered what indentations are in the for loops, so make sure to check that out as well. If the conditional test right here evaluates to a true, then Python will execute the code in the following if statements, or any line for that matter. And if the test evaluates to a false, Python will ignore the code following the if statement. So right here you can see that the variable x is equal to 100. X, is it greater than 50? Yes, it is. So this evaluation is, or this expression is equal to true. It's a true. So if true, we will do whatever is in this block, which means we will print out x is greater than 50. If I change this x from 100 to 12, right click and run, you can see that first of all the expression evaluates to a false, and we don't get anything printed out because the code inside of this if statement will not execute. But what if we actually wanted to get an output if this expression is false? So as you can see in here, we have the else statement attached to the if statement. So what happens is if the first expression evaluates to a false, we get whatever is in the else block of code. As you can see right here, x is not greater than 50. But if we change this from 100 or from 12 to 120, right click and run, now we only get x is greater than 50 and we don't execute whatever is in the else block. And just like we've had with the for loops, you can always add multiple lines, and no matter how many lines you add, all of them will be executed as long as they are part of the same block of code and have the same level of indentation. So oftentimes you'll need to test more than 2 possible situations, and to evaluate these you can use the elif block or syntax. It's called the elif syntax. Right click and run, and as you can see right here, 12 is less than, or it's not greater than 50 at least, so we don't get this line printed out, but we also don't get the else printed out. Instead, what we do get is this line printed out. So keep in mind that only one of the blocks will get executed. So you can see right here 12, it's not greater than 50, but it is less than 20. So this expression right here evaluates to a true. You can even test it out right here. If I duplicate it and make it less than 20, right click and run, you can see that evaluates to a true, which means this block is working, which means we print out at least it's less than 20. And again, keep in mind, if I do the following, what do you think the output is going to be? Just take a second and think about it. Of course, when I right click and I run, you'll see that x is greater than 50, even though it doesn't make sense. But because this expression evaluates to a true, that means we execute this block of code and we get the following output. Okay, so as you can see in here, we can add multiple elifs one after the other. And it's very important to keep in mind that the hierarchy is important, because remember, only one of the expressions is going to be executed and one of the blocks of code are going to be expressed. I'll show you what that means in just a bit. But as you can see in here, we have the age equals to 33. So this condition is not working, or at least it evaluates to false. This expression evaluates to a false, this one as well, and finally we have this expression that has a small squiggly line under it that we're going to talk about. You can see right here, simplified chain comparison. We'll see that in just a bit. But before we do that, the age is equal to 33, which means it's greater than 20 and it's less than 65. So this person is an adult. This block of code does indeed execute. And if we change this to 1, for example, right click and run, you can see that this person is a baby. And if I change this to 12, right click and run, this person is a kid, etc., etc., you get the point. Now this is what I mean when I say hierarchy is very important. I will select this line, hold down Shift Alt and move it up. So now we check for the 20 before the 13, and when I right click and I run, you'd expect that somebody who's 12 should be a kid, right? But when I right click and I run, you'll see that somebody that's under 12 is a teenager, which is not correct. But the way that we've written our program now, and I don't want you to do this, because of the way that we've written the program, we evaluate this expression, it turns out that it's true, and we get the following output. So I've taken it back right here. Now let's look at the simplified chain comparison. If I right click and I show context and action, you can see that I can change this to a simplified chain comparison. And if I click on that, you can see that I get a simpler expression of this. Now, if you're using a IDE that's different than PyCharm, that's okay, you might not get this, but anyways, you can write this way. And finally, in here, instead of using this elif, we could have simply typed in else. Not ellipse, we could have written else. Why? Because anything that's other than these values, like for example, I don't know, 9,000, will evaluate to this person is old. If I had kept the elif as before, if I did 9,000 again, you'll see that that person is indeed still old. So sometimes you might be able to use the elif instead of the else instead of the elif. Okay, so now that we've looked at how conditional tests work and we've applied them to our if statements and made use of them, it's time to again apply these if statements or make them work with lists. Let's continue on. Okay, so what I did in here is I combined if statements with lists. So I have the list of my favorite fruits. I have my fruit right here, that is apple, and I'm checking if the fruit is not in the favorite fruits, and we've already seen how we can do this in our conditional testing right here. So if the fruit is not in the favorite fruits, then I'm going to print out this is a disgrace because apples are amazing or whatever. And the same thing holds true in here. If this condition evaluates to a false, that means that we get an else, meaning that if the apple is indeed inside of fruits, then this is a good list. If I change this to pineapple, right click and run, now you can see that this is a disgrace because pineapples is amazing, or pineapple is amazing. So if I right click and I run, you'll see that as always we print out all of our variables. But there is a small hidden problem in here that you need to avoid at all costs. Now at first sight you might be thinking, oh wait, there's no problem in here, everything is working fine, there's no error, there's no warnings. But there is indeed a problem because we have a temporary variable created on the for loops, and again, if you don't know what this is, you can always refer back to the for loops video that I made. And we also have a variable outside of this temporary variable, outside of the context of the for loop, that is the fruit, and this is very bad. You always need to have different variable names because this can cause confusion for you and confusion for the Python interpreter. So I'm going to change this to be called favorite fruit. Okay, so what I did in here is I went through the list of fruits, and every single time I accessed an item inside of the favorite fruits, I put it in the temporary variable that is fruit, and then I checked if the fruit is equal to my favorite fruit. I gave it a special output where I said that this fruit is the best. Otherwise, I simply printed out the fruit as normal. So if I change this to cherry, now I get apple printed out normally and cherry is printed out in a special way. Okay, so now we are working with two lists at the same time. First of all, we have the available items in our local store, and then we have the groceries that we want to buy. So what I did is I went through the groceries that we have and I checked every single item inside and I put it inside of the items temporary variable. So if the item is not in the available items, I'm going to print out that this item is not available. So for example, in here we're trying to buy apples, but if we look in our available items, we don't have apples, so we print out the apples are not available. And this is a very nifty way of working with two lists at the same time and having, well, a very nice output. Okay, so we've covered conditional tests, we've looked at if statements, and we've seen how if statements work with lists. Now it's time for a bit of a challenge, or when I say challenge, it means you have to challenge your knowledge or the knowledge that you've learned so far in a mini project. So, congratulations! You just landed a new job as a data scientist after finishing the course at 2M Python Dev. You need to analyze some data. Welcome to the boring world. First of all, you'll need to print out the length of this list. You'll have a list down below in the comment. It's a big list, so copy it, paste it, don't write it out yourself. Print out the length of this list. Next, you'll need to create a loop over this entire list. You should be familiar with this if you've done the previous video. Inside this loop, we need to do the following. So, first of all, you'll need to print out how many integers, floats, and strings there are. This is a list of different integers, floats, and strings. You need to count every single one of these. Next, you'll need to print out how many even and odd integers there are, because floats and strings cannot be even or odd, so this is where you start using if statements. You actually start using it right here, but this is where it becomes very important. Next, you'll need to print out how many positive and negative numbers there are. Remember, floats can be negative as well as integers. You'll need to get what is the maximum and the minimum number in this entire list, including integers and floats. I recommend that you use the max and min. We've already seen these before. You can even Google how it works. What is the average length of a string in this list? Now, this is a bit of a harder challenge. If you're very ambitious and you've done everything correctly, you can do the following. You need to get the average length of the strings that we have. What is the average value of the numbers? Also a very challenging part, but you can do it. And here's a hint. You will need to use the nested if statements. It's just like normal if statements. You just have an if statement inside of an if statement. It's like if statement inception. I don't think I will keep this in the video. But anyways, and you can also use the type or the is instance. So I recommend that you Google this and you look at how it works in order to separate the integers and the floats and the strings. And of course, you need, for every single one of these, you need to initialize a variable at the top and then modify it inside of the main huge for loop. So pause the video right now and go do the challenge. Okay, so as you can see, we got our data list and it's just a list of different and random integers, floats, and strings. And because it's a huge list, most IDEs will have a small little arrow right here that you can press just to compress it, because we don't need to look at it all the time. In here, I initialized all of my counters based on the challenge that we've had. You can see I looked at all of the challenges. I determined, okay, I need 3 variables right here, 2 right here, 2 right here, etc., etc. So I initialized everything, and actually in here, instead of writing int underscore count equals 0, then float underscore count equals 0, etc., I just wrote them on a single line, just like I did in here, and finally, this is the weird part that you probably weren't sure how to do. Instead of writing 0, which is perfectly normal, you can make it minus infinity because we're looking for the maximum number, so we write it as minus infinity using this float. Don't worry if you didn't figure this one out, it's a bit advanced. If you did, found it in some research, that's great. Finally, we did the main important task in here, which is printing out the length of our data list, which turns out has 347 items in it. Okay, so in here what I did is I created a for loop over the entire data list, and every single time I accessed an item, I put it in the temporary variable that is the item. Then I looked up isInstance and I understood how it works, where if I let me hover over it and see if it provides me any documentation, and you can see first of all we presented with an object. Don't worry if you didn't fully understand this, on the internet you probably found a much cleaner resource. And the second one is the class that we're looking to compare this with. So first of all I check if it's an integer. If it is, then I increase the integer count. Then I checked if it's a float. If it is, using an elif, of course. If it is, then I increase the float count, and finally I increase the string count if it turned out to be a string, and finally I printed all of this out. So as you can see from our data, we have 119 integers, 116 floats, and 112 strings, which is a very nice equal variation between them. Oh, and by the way, before I continue, if you didn't even get to this point or you were having a big trouble on how to do the rest, if this helps you, you can pause the video at any point and just continue the challenge yourself. Don't feel pressured that you had to do everything from scratch, or you feel that maybe it's embarrassing that you didn't do the first part, so now you don't do the second part. No, doesn't matter. It's about doing your best. If you feel that this was a very nice step for you to move forward, pause the video, continue forward. Okay, so what I did in here is I checked for even and odd, and the way I did this is I took this item and I used the modulo 2 on it, and if it's equal to 0, which means that there is no remainder, and I believe we've covered this. If you weren't sure how to do this, a simple search would have given you the answer. If the modulo of 2 is equal to 0, meaning that we don't have any remainder when we divide this item by 2, then we increase the even count, otherwise we increase the odd count using the if-else syntax. Oh, and I printed it out as well. Turns out we have 116 even integers and 3 odd ones. Okay, so this time, because we can have positive numbers if they are integers, and we can have positive or negative numbers if they are floats, I had to copy and paste this code in 2 places. Now, something very important that you need to keep in mind is whenever you find yourself copying and pasting code and using it multiple times, it means that you're starting to get redundant code and that there is probably a better way of writing this. But since we still haven't taken functions, this will be covered in subsequent videos. But again, sometimes, as we'll see, we can even reformat this to make it better. And I also, of course, printed out the positive and negatives, and as you can see, we have 118 positives and 117 negatives. Very nice distribution. Okay, so again, what we did in here, and this is part of the challenge that I told you was a bit challenging, well, that's the whole point, is using the max, and I did a mistake in here. We use the min and the min. See, when you duplicate, you have to be very careful, making sure that everything is correct before you duplicate or move on. So the max number that we've already established was -infinity. What we do is we compare it with the item that we currently have, and the max allows us to get the higher number. So we provided with as many arguments as we want. In this case, we provided it with -infinity and the first item, which was the nebula. Well, thankfully, we already had an if statement in here that made sure that we're dealing with an integer. So whatever the integer was, turns out that the item, let's say it was -9876, that is much bigger than -infinity, so now the max number became -9000, etc. If we come up to 1, where item is equal to 1, then the max is 1, that means the max number becomes max. And we keep comparing until we get to the highest number, and we do the same in the integer or when the item is an integer and when the item is a float. But again, in here we have copy and pasted code, so alarm bells must be going off in your head. And we can see that, I didn't print it out, you can see that the maximum number is 11,300 and the lowest number is 9,876, which was the first integer that we encounter. Nice. Okay, so what I did in here is I got the total string length. So every time we encountered a string item, we got its length and we added it to the total string length. So once we've added up the total string length, we took that average by taking the total string length and dividing it by the string count, and then we printed it out, and it turns out that on average each string that we have has a 7.616 length. Okay, so what I did in here is I created a new if statement, keep in mind, inside of the for loop because it's indented, and what I did is I got the total number of value and added the item every single time. And I made sure that in here that when I checked for the instance that it is an integer and a float at the same time, and I passed it as a tuple. This is a tuple. If you remember from a previous video, you can look back. Why did I use the tuple, or how did I even know that I should use a tuple? When I hover over the instance, you can see in here I can provide the type, I can provide a tuple of types. So always read the documentation. You can even see an example in here of how you can use it, where A and B are the different types, and then we have X. And once I added everything, I divided the total number value by the integer count and the float count added together, because remember, these are all numbers, and it turns out that the average count is 2,590. Now, remember when I told you when you're copying and pasting numbers, that is not good at all. So since I've created this if statement, now I can actually cut this from here, paste it in here, and I can even remove all of this unnecessary code right here. And if I right click and I run, I should have the same numbers outputted, but I was able to save myself the copy and pasting, and that is always very, very important. I was able to do this. Why? Because we were using this code when it's an integer, and we were using this code when it was a float. So I created an if statement that combines these two, and then I printed out. And by the way, we could have even used an elif in here and added it to this chain, but I felt that was not necessary. And in a case, it wouldn't be even correct, because if we added this, then the integers would be caught on the first if statement and the floats would be caught on the second one, so this one wouldn't work. That's why I separated it into another if right here. Okay, so my fellow Python programmers, that was if statements. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got value. Again, if you did, please make sure to slap that like button. Please make sure to subscribe. And yeah, in order to continue on your learning journey, I didn't even know what we have next. I had to double check. You need to watch this video where we cover dictionaries, a very important tool, very powerful data structuring tool. So make sure to watch this video. I'll move even the mic for you right here. Yes, you can see my face. Okay, yeah. Dictionaries. Continue your Python programming journey. To Python Dev.